Hey everybody, it's Jenny from Norman S. Wright. So I want to do one more video on sound before we move on to some other topics. Today I want to talk about how sound adds when you have more than one sound source in a space. So let's get started. So hopefully you remember from the previous videos that sound is measured in decibels against a frequency. So you may say something like a sound was 65 dB at 63 hertz. We group the frequencies into octave bands that are centered around 63, 125, 250, 500, 1000, 2000, 4000, and 8000 hertz. And these octave bands are 1 through 8. So first you need to know that you have to add the decibels by octave bands. So you can't add your 63 hertz sound to your 8000 hertz sound and get anything meaningful. So for the rest of this, let's just assume I'm adding the same octave band. It doesn't really matter which one. So let's say you have a sound source that has 70 dB and another source that is 64 dB. Do those add up to 134 dB? I hope not. That would be a horribly loud world to live in. 130 dB is like a jet taking off. So how does it actually work? Sound addition is a log function, but instead of getting into the math, I'm going to pull up this handy chart. So now if you have a 70 dB sound source and a 64 dB sound source, what you actually do is subtract the 64 from the 70 dB and you get 6 dB. Now let's label the chart over here. The bottom is the sound difference and the top represents the decibels you add. So we'll go up from the 6 to the line and then over to 1. And so if you have a 70 dB sound source and a 64 dB sound source, together they will sound 1 dB louder than the loudest sound source, which is 71 dB. Another thing to note on this chart is that if your two sound sources are the same, i.e. their difference is 0, you add 3 dB. On the opposite end of that, if your sound sources are greater than 10 dB apart, you're going to hear the louder sound source only. So if we had an 80 dB and a 70 dB sound source, you'd only hear the 80 dB sound source. If we had two 70 dB sound sources, they'd sound like 73 dB. Okay, so once you know how you add your sound data, now you can add each octave band's sound data together to get the sound pressure for the two units in a space, for example. And then you can plot that on an NC chart and get the NC of that space as well. Another handy rule is for the same sound sources, when you add more of them to a space, it follows 10 log n. So if you have one sound source, we'll call it a fan, and you double that to two fans, n equals 2, and 10 log n, which is 2, equals 3. So you would add 3 dB. So if you went from one fan to four fans, n is 4, 10 log 4 is 6, and you'd add 6 dB. If you went from one fan to 10 fans, 10 log 10 is 10, so you would add 10 dB. But also if you go from 5 fans to 10 fans, n is only 2, and then we go back to adding just 3 dB. So this assumes that all of the sound sources are within range and you can hear them all at the same time. So these are sound sources that are in the 10 feet around the occupant, say. It's more likely that what you'd be wondering instead of fans is how do two diffusers sound in a space? So diffuser sound peaks in the fourth band, and in the fourth band 1 dB is about 1 NC. So if you had two NC25 diffusers, you would add 3, because the N is 2 here. You would add 3 dB and you'd get NC28 is what it would sound like in that space. So that's how sound adds. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and thanks for watching.